From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have coming up on the program. A rock and a hard place, the new headache over Gibraltar for negotiators trying to hammer out a Brexit deal. Jumping the queue, the UK Prime Minister's controversial comments over immigration. Blowing the whistle, the EU pushes new rules to protect those who call out bad behavior. Caught on camera, the Italian town that nabbed 58,000 speeders and a small fortune in just weeks. And in tonight's Raw Moment, a musical plea from the UK Prime Minister to Northern Ireland's DUP. All right, it is time to meet our panel for tonight. Joining us is Nina Schick. She is the political commentator and director of data and polling with Rasmussen Global. Nina, which of these stories do you like?
I think I love the kind of new Brexit meme of the moment. You know, Brexit really is kind of the gift that doesn't stop giving, both politically and in terms of internet viral phenomena.
This was quite a nice video, actually. All right, also joining us is William Legg, Earl of Dartmouth and an independent MEP who belongs to the Freedom and Direct Democracy Group. Which one
Good evening.
are you watching? Which of these stories did you like?
Gibraltar, Gibraltar and Gibraltar.
Absolutely. All right. And also joining us is Ramon Tremosa. He is an MEP from Spain with the Alliance for Liberals and Democrats. And which of these stories are you watching closely?
Well, I come from Barcelona, so I'm Catalan MEP. So, of course, I will talk about Gibraltar also. And the concept of how in Spain they see democracy and how they respect the will of the people.
So two watching Gibraltar, and that's exactly where we will be beginning tonight, because Chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier may have a new thorn in his side. Spain is threatening to reject the draft withdrawal agreement as foreign ministers meet in Brussels to sign off on the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And it all comes down to the disputed territory of Gibraltar. Now, Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell says that Madrid should get a special veto on any future trade agreement between the EU and the UK, because he says the current agreement does not cover Gibraltar. And the British-owned peninsula located on Spain's south coast will no longer be part of the EU once the UK leaves in March. And now Spain is being criticized for raising the issue at the last minute, just days before a crucial summit in Brussels. Well, the Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell said that negotiations between the UK and the EU do not apply to Gibraltar and are separate negotiations. And then he said, in Europe, it is not over until it's over. You have always got to be prepared for a surprise at the last minute. All right, let us talk about this. What happened there? I'll start with you, Nina. You know, for all the talk about the Irish border, the backstop, did we just forget this little place called Gibraltar? What happened there?
Look, I don't think that politicians have really forgotten this. This has been a thorn in the negotiations, very complicated negotiations from the beginning. And I really doubt that Michel Barnier hasn't had parallel conversations with his Spanish counterparts about this issue over the last 2 years. If I was being really cynical, I would say, you know, perhaps Spain has piped up about the issue of Gibraltar right now in order to let Theresa May have a win. So at least domestically, it plays out really well. You know, I think I can safely put my money on the fact that this issue will not be sinking the Brexit deal at this moment. I think throughout the negotiations, the domestic volatility and uncertainty has been getting this deal through Parliament. I don't see that happening on the EU side. I don't think the EU kind of 27 will sink what's on the table right now.
Is this a particular strategic play? I mean, the timing of it, what do you think?
Well, all Spanish governments have been, since Franco regime, using Gibraltar for electoral purposes. There is no budget in Spain because socialist government is unable to get support for that. So let's take Gibraltar issue. 5 days ago, Prime Minister Sanchez said that the agreement was fine. And today, the foreign minister comes out with this. So I want to warn...
But they said they weren't briefed properly. That's the reason they were giving. They did not see.
Let me warn all Europeans the concept of democracy that the Spaniards has, because they don't have any respect for the will of the Gibraltarians that some years ago voted in a 98% in a referendum to remain British. And this declaration of the Minister of Spain doesn't take into account the will of the people of Gibraltar. This is very dangerous, as we think that EU is a democracy.
All right, so how big of an issue could this become and bring us the British point of view as well?
It's very, very important. it's very important for people in Gibraltar. And I must, if I may, take issue with your introduction, calling it a disputed territory. It isn't a disputed territory. It's been a British territory since 1711. It's now self-governing. And as my colleague here has very ably pointed out, they want to stay part of Britain and they don't want to be part of Spain. Now, if you're an MEP, you endlessly hear people rabbiting on about European values. And one of the most important European values, perhaps the most important one, is self-determination. So it is absolutely offensive, frankly. It's offensive, actually, to watch the European Union nomenclatura seeking to deny people of Gibraltar self-determination, as they're doing in Catalonia as well. But that's probably another subject you don't want to talk about.
I realistically don't think that's what's on the table. Nobody's saying that Gibraltar is now has to remain part of the EU. If you want to talk about the democratic will of the people, it's quite clear that Gibraltarians want to remain part of the UK, and it's also quite clear that they actually didn't want to leave the EU, because if you look at the result of the referendum in Gibraltar, they distinctly did not want to leave. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I really don't think, like I said, I think this is all a bit of domestic optics and power play. I really don't think what's on the table is that somehow the EU or Spain is trying to rip Gibraltar away from Spain.
That's what you were trying to point out, but it is two separate issues. So, okay, where do we go from here then?
Well, where we go from here is that this agreement is awful, as I've said elsewhere, on other matters, which I'm sure you don't want to hear about. However, the one vaguely okay thing about it, and I did put out a statement, was just saying that those provisions of it which apply to Gibraltar were okay and even quite good for Gibraltar. Now, if these are going to be torn away, we in the UK are left with absolutely less than nothing. And I'll make one other point too. The European Union negotiators keep on saying that the agreement cannot be changed. If it can change in the context of Gibraltar, it can be changed in the context of a large number of other things. And I'll give you about 5 examples straight away, which I'm sure you don't know.
Let me say that, in my opinion, this is a firework for the Spanish foreign ministers, because if at the end Theresa May gets the support in the British Parliament to go forward with this agreement, Spain will not resist the EU pressure.
Do you agree that it's domestic optics?
Yes. This has been looking for the possible next snap Spanish elections.
Okay, so
there is no way that Spain is going to sink the deal that's on the table, not after all the effort that has been invested by both the European side and the British side to get to the point where we are now.
So what is the point of making this noise, though?
Why are they making noise?
All of the instability is around whether or not Theresa May can get it through her parliament at home. And I think, incidentally, the first time she tries, she's not going to be able to. So it helps her to look like she's put up a fight, Spain has backed down. That helps her to sell this deal to the hardcore Brexiteer right of her own party. That has always been the dynamic as the negotiations have folded out. And in terms of this being a bad deal, I mean, this was inevitably the deal that Britain was going to get. There is not going to be a wholesale renegotiation of what's on the table.
There's a lot more, obviously, happening in Brexit, and where Theresa May, where we will be seeing Theresa May in the weeks and days to come. We've been hearing today there's been a lot of focus on EU countries' reaction to the Brexit deal that Theresa May has put forward, but there's been plenty of action in London. Let's catch up on all the latest developments on that side. Don't look down. Theresa May's position at the top of British politics is in need of more than a bit of structural support this evening. Because last night, at this ordinary-looking session of the House of Commons, the DUP fired a warning shot at the Prime Minister. The Unionists, on whose support the Conservatives rely to stay in power, abstained on a number of amendments to the government's finance bill. Make no mistake, this was a moment of high drama in Westminster, with one senior opposition figure suggesting that Labour should now be given the opportunity to form a government. And there's no sign of clearing skies for Theresa May. The British Prime Minister last night bowed to pressure from MPs, including some of her own, and agreed to publish economic forecasts comparing her Brexit deal with remaining in the European Union. Pro-EU campaigners hope this will chip away at the case for leaving the EU. Mrs. May, on the other hand, may be left trying to sweep unhelpful economic projections under the carpet. And could these be the so-called men in grey suits? Members of the Brexiteer European Research Group marched on Downing Street last night to meet with the Prime Minister. 1 hour later, they emerged and, much to the disappointment of the awaiting media, did not speak to the press. With reports suggesting their meeting was constructive and Brexiteers struggling to trigger a no-confidence vote, has Theresa May's moment of maximum danger now passed? Well, Tory MP and Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg, he continued to slam Theresa May for her draft deal today. He held a press conference with other pro-Brexit MPs and industry leaders, calling for a harder Brexit and a future Britain without Mrs. May at the helm. Well, let's take a look. But what caught our eye here? It wasn't necessarily the content of the panel, but what it looked like. These representatives, the European Research Group and Global Britain, would like to design an alternative picture to what a post-Brexit future would look like. And if it's anything like this picture, the future may look a little bit like the past. So there we have it. When we look at that, is this a taste of what Theresa May is about to face? I mean, the DUP has fired a warning shot.
Look, as I mentioned, everyone is unhappy with the deal, whether you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer or you're DUP. Everyone does not like what's on the table because fundamentally the assessment is that Britain is going to be in a worse place than when it was before. Now, where opinions differ is that, the hardcore Brexiteers say that's because Theresa May is a bad negotiator, because Ollie Robbins, her chief negotiator in the cabinet, has kind of done some stitch up. The EU is punishing the UK. But I think realistically, if you consider the Tory party's red lines and the fact that this was always going to be a damage control exercise, this is inevitably where the UK would end up vis-a-vis the negotiations. As I've already said plenty of times on this programme, the big problem for Theresa May is getting it through Parliament. And as to actually anybody challenging her, I don't see anyone being able to step up and having to take her position right now. So I still think my base case is she remains PM and manages to get the deal, maybe not on the first try, but somehow through the Parliament.
But if we look at the opposition, that very diverse picture that we saw there of the Brexiteers, are they finally getting their act together? I mean,
with respect, this isn't the point at all. The key point is that Labour are committed to voting against it.
Yeah.
With Labour voting against it and the DUP voting against it, which it's apparent that they will, it's over anyway, irrespective of how many Brexiteers vote against it, which will be somewhere between 40 and 80. The fact of the matter is, this deal will not get past the House of Commons. It will not get past the House of Commons, certainly the first time. Now, maybe it will get past the second time or the third time, with the government making all sorts of threats. But if you get in a position that the government starts to threaten its own people, it's not a very healthy position. It's a lousy deal. It doesn't command any support from anywhere in the political spectrum, not just from grey-haired males like myself. And that is the key point. The key point is Labour is going to vote against it. Right. With the support of the DUP and the minority parties and a large number of Conservatives.
But all the Labour Party will vote against?
They're committed to voting against it.
Yeah, so if we're watching this from this side of the channel, what are the expectations from the EU side if looking at the scenario in London?
Well, today I wear a Scottish tie, so this is why I...
Is that why?
Because the SNP... Yes. No, it is... Well, for my personal view, this is a good agreement because we want to continue at least having trade with the UK.
But knowing that it's not going to get through,
yes,
given the numbers.
I'm not an expert in British politics, so maybe you are right, but I have doubts about that the all Labour MPs will vote against as a bloc. And I think that Theresa May will get more support in her party. So maybe there are...
Theresa May will definitely get some Labour MPs backing her deal. The questions of how many, if you do the kind of parliamentary arithmetic, it looks like right now impossible to get the deal through. But I think as the realization hits that there is no going back and renegotiating the deal, and therefore if the deal is not voted through, the next most likely option is the chaotic Brexit, a no-deal Brexit. I think with some cosmetic changes, it will get through on the second.
And as if she hasn't already been facing enough pushback, she is facing even more pushback after saying that EU nationals will be no longer able to, quote, jump the queue into the UK job market post-Brexit. And for more on this, I am joined by our London correspondent, Vincent McAviney. Vincent, what exactly was Theresa May trying to sell there by saying that?
Good evening, Tessa. Well, these are comments made by Theresa May at the CBI conference, and that's an audience there of business leaders. She was talking about the plans, and what she actually said wasn't new. It's been something that's been spoken about for the last couple of months, that the UK will move from low-skilled immigration to high-skilled immigration. The Prime Minister wants to attract the top talent from around the world, and really what she's reacting to is a feeling during the Brexit referendum that the UK had opened its borders too wide, that there was too much migration. And when you do look into the figures, the migration David Cameron once promised to bring down into the tens of thousands, but in 2015 it peaked at 332,000 net migration, and of that 184,000 came actually from the EU. Now, it had climbed since the expansion of the EU in the early 2000s, but this number was the trigger that many believe led to that vote to leave in 2016. So Theresa May knows that immigration has to be tackled, and here is what she had to say.
Once we've left the EU, we will be fully in control of who comes here. It will no longer be the case that EU nationals, regardless of the skills or experience they have to offer, can jump the queue ahead of engineers from Sydney or software developers from Delhi. Instead of a system based on where a person is from, we will have one that is built around the talents and skills a person has to offer.
Now, other countries mentioned by Theresa May include New Zealand, Australia and India, those countries that make up the Commonwealth. And there was actually quite a large vote from people from the South East Asian community living here in the UK for Brexit, because they wanted to be able to reopen those links to countries that the UK has historical ties with. And the Prime Minister also mentioned America as well. Her hope is that quite quickly, or after whatever happens on the 29th of March, whether we leave the EU with her deal or we leave in the chaotic Brexit, the no deal, that a deal can be struck with America that would see greater migration between the two countries.
Yeah, Vincent, I mean, this is, as you say, this is something that she has said before, but this time she's saying it in the context of a draft deal that we've all seen. Why is she getting all this backlash?
Well, I mean, Theresa May has played a very careful game on this red button issue. She went out very quickly in the negotiation period saying she wouldn't treat EU citizens as negotiating chips. She assured them very quickly that they would have the right to stay, and she also said even in the event of no deal they would have the right to stay. But there is a backlash coming because of the language. So Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party in Scotland, criticised it as saying it was really disgraceful, about queue jumping. And there was also a backlash from business. The director of the CBI, the event she was speaking as, said that free movement of people is ending and a new immigration system represents a seismic shift, one that firms across the country need to adapt to, but it's a false choice between high and low skilled workers, would deny businesses from house builders to healthcare providers the vital skills they need to succeed. So businesses are sounding a warning that there isn't the amount of low skilled labour needed in the UK to keep the economy ticking along as it is. Particularly they're mentioning the housing sector and the care sector. There is a huge void in the gap, there's a huge gap in the skill set here to provide in those industries.
All right, thank you for that. Vincent McAviney live there for us in London. All right, Theresa May, she was using that kind of rhetoric, that kind of language. Was she framing it a certain way to try and sell it a different way, to business leaders in her particular audience?
She's definitely trying to frame it in terms of trying to sell her Brexit deal. Because if you are of the view that, the British public voted for Brexit in part because of concerns around immigration, she has to be really tough on, ending free movement and what this means for the UK's immigration regime. And that's indeed one reason why the UK is leaving the single market, right? Its biggest market on its doorstep, because it wants to end free movement. In terms of EU nationals jumping the queue, I mean, actually that's not true, because the UK is able to set its rules for non-EU immigration as it wants. It has nothing to do with EU free movement. So if it wanted to let in more Indian engineers or doctors, there's nothing preventing the UK from doing that. And I think that what business is concerned about now is that this kind of arbitrary rules-based system, which Theresa May says she wants to enforce, is not necessarily going to deliver for the needs of the economy. You already see that, for example, in the numbers of EU migrants leaving the UK and how that's affecting key industries in the UK, not least the NHS.
Yeah, so it's basically just empty words.
No. It's actually very important. First of all, the Confederation of British Industries, who they were talking to, they're all immigration junkies. If they want to solve their labour problem, they should simply train people better and pay people more, and they would solve it absolutely immediately. But the very important point, and I partly agree with you, your emphasis was, I think, a bit off colour. At the moment, citizens of EU member states are in a privileged position in the sense that irrespective of their qualifications, even if they have none, irrespective of their skills, even if they have none, irrespective of their earning ability, even if they have none, they have the absolute right to live, work and settle in the United Kingdom. By comparison, if you are an Australian cancer surgeon, if you are an Indian nuclear physicist, if you are a Canadian solar energy specialist, you have to take your place at the back of the queue. Now, it's just a question of fact that on Brexit, the privileged position ceases. And I don't see why that should attract the kind of abuse which it seems to be getting.
But as Nina was pointing out, it's not actually true. You can jump the queue if we were to use that term even now.
No, but you don't have you don't have an absolute right. If you're a citizen of an EU member state, you have an absolute right. And there's a distinction between being able to get in and having an absolute right. One further point, it's really very important. Your correspondent there quoted the figure of 323,000 net in 2015. The gross figure was 650,000. So in the last 5 years, if you look the figures up, which I did just before coming on the programme, we've had over 500,000 gross people coming into the country each year. In 2 years, we had over 600,000. And the fact is there's a national consensus, there's a national consensus in the UK that this has got to be managed. And that's all this is. Now, I'm not in the same political party as the Prime Minister, and I haven't been for many, many years, but she's absolutely right on this. And the so-called backlash from the immigration junkies and the usual suspects and the people who are in favour of unrestricted immigration should just be ignored and faced down. And I very much hope the Prime Minister does do that.
There is no problem in saying you want to have lower immigration in your country. That's a perfectly valid position for a government to take. Nonetheless, what the government then has to do is honestly talk about the economic trade-offs that entails. For example, when it comes to EU migrants in the UK, by the UK Treasury's own estimates, they are a net contributor to the tune of £7 billion a year. So I think what people are not liking in terms of her tone is that she's trying to make out that EU migrants are somehow scroungers or not contributing to British society, which they are. And I think, I'm a good example. I've been living in the UK for 15 years. I am definitely a contributor to the UK.
wanted to say?
Yeah, just to say that I share your view, Nina's view, because I understand that it was a concern and there was an argument for the Brexiters to have control of the borders. But I think that Prime Minister should be very careful looking at the accurate words to explain not only to the British citizens but also to the European citizens what we are talking about. Because, for instance, from Spain there is a lot of nurses and doctors that are working in the UK, and what are you going to do next year?
Well, where they can continue to work there, and they continue to work there on a work permit basis for people coming in the future. People who are currently working there, the Prime Minister has been absolutely clear that they have the right to remain whatever happens. So we're only talking about the thing in the future. One tiny also correction.
Okay.
Yes, it's 7 billion, but this is a 2.5 trillion economy. 7 billion is really not very material, actually.
Because the actual number of immigrants isn't very high.
Well, we can all check
nobody
these
else
figures
thinks that. It's about 5 million. Is that high or low? Most people think it's rather high.
All right, thank you.
But you'll tell me it's not.
We'll have a lot more Brexit talk, definitely, for in the coming days, for sure. All right, and a lot more coming up on Raw Politics for you. Italy orders the seizure of the migrant rescue boat Aquarius. We'll get all the latest from our team in the Cube on that story. Plus, irony anyone? Donald Trump, his daughter Ivanka, is in hot water over using her private email for White House business. Don't go away. welcome back to Our Politics. A would-be trailblazer of a law to protect whistleblowers took a step closer to reality today. The Legal Affairs Committee approved an EU-wide protection plan for those who report fraud, criminal activity and other bad behavior at public and private institutions. Now, if it passes the next stages of the legislative gauntlet, the law would protect whistleblowers and colleagues who help them, prohibit employers retaliating, for example, through forcing leaves of absence or revoking security clearances, and it would prioritize whistleblowers' law over trade secrets, and it would ensure that proper reporting channels are established in private firms with over 250 employees and all public institutions. Right now, the legislation comes after a string of high-profile whistleblower cases from Edward Snowden to the Paradise Papers. Now, yesterday, a whistleblower who reported alleged money laundering at Danske Bank's Estonian branch testified before a Danish parliamentary commission. He said that he notified his superiors 4 times, but no action was taken. And he had this to say about the role of whistleblowers.
I'm here because I feel there's a moral obligation that as far as possible I'll be able to share my story with the members of Parliament and with the Danish people. I'm not here because I want to be. I was a whistleblower in 2014. It's an absolute disgrace that this story is still going on in 2018. An absolute disgrace. And it's an absolute disgrace that my name was made public in the newspapers. Who is ever going to want to be a whistleblower again? Whoever in Estonia or Denmark is ever going to want to whistleblow?
All right, joining us to discuss this, we still have Nina Schick, Director of Data and Polling at Rasmussen Global. And we are also joined by Virginie Rosière, who is the rapporteur behind this whistleblowing draft law, and Nick Ayosa, who's a policy officer at Transparency International, specializing in whistleblowing and misuse of EU funding. All right, Virginie, I'll start with you. What does this law change, really?
Well, first, it will give protection in all the member states of the European Union. For the moment, you've got at least almost 10 member states protecting whistleblowers. That's it. So then they will be protected everywhere in Europe, and also it will put quite high standards in this protection, as you said, forbid retaliation in the place of work, and also if you're sued for any kind of infringement, like, for example, Raphaël Allais or Antoine Deltour, they were prosecuted for theft, then you will be protected in front of the court, and in the end you can get assistance. And also the fact that you disclose information will be considered as a fair thing, and you won't be condemned in the end.
So the law was essentially broadened to include a lot more things. Okay, Nick, I will ask you, why did it take this long, do you think, for Europe to get to this point? As the whistleblower was saying, why now? Why just now?
Well, I think it's been a long time in the making, and this is something we've called on for years. I think now what we've seen in the last 3 years is that here in Brussels, there's been a string of leaks by whistleblowers that have helped shape large tracks of legislation over the past couple of years, from LuxLeaks to Panama Papers to legislation on tax transparency to anti-money laundering, where now finally Brussels realizes that they have to raise the bar and help protect these whistleblowers who are helping shape the legislation coming from Brussels.
Yeah, and we were talking particularly about this Danske Bank, which is about 28 billion. I think it's considered one of the biggest money laundering scandals in European history, if with the amount involved. Now, this kind, what's preventing the whistleblower of revealing the information is the clause, the non-disclosure clause. I mean, is there going to be a lot of backlash from business in trying to get this out in the corporate side of things?
Sure, I'm sure that corporates and business, will be very wary as this law comes in, but absolutely it's a step in the right direction, and it's really encouraging to see the EU kind of leading the way on this. If you have inherent systems that are protective of corruption and wrongdoing, and somebody feels that it's their moral and ethical obligation to come forward, I don't think a non-disclosure agreement, a legality, a technicality should prevent them from doing so. So I think it's a great thing.
Legislation should take precedence over
It should take precedence and encourage cultural change in organizations. I mean, if it terrifies corporations and businesses who are engaged in illegal or illicit activity, good. They should change that practices.
Now, something more, I think, interesting and probably will get a lot more debate is national secrets. If, for example, we have whistleblowers who would reveal something that is dangerous to national security, what does this law do to protect whistleblowers like that, or would they fall through the cracks somehow?
We still fix a limit with, as we say, national security, and also some professional secrets, such as medical secret, for example, or the secret between a lawyer and his client, as long as, of course, there is nothing illegal at stake. That's the limit.
So what if someone, what if there is classified information, but it has to be revealed, let's just say it is in public interest, that it has to be revealed. We have some examples of that. What does the law do?
Well, of course, that would be for, as I said, national security. It's really something member states are very focused on. So they will be setting up their framework. But we have general rules. As long as this is something illegal, then the directive will say if it's illegal and it's disclosed, you were right to disclose it, because then you were...
Just very quickly, do you think the law should include that?
Well, I mean, what we're talking about here is an EU directive that is extremely ambitious and something we support. But again, it's not the magic bullet. Okay. I mean, we are limited by the competence of the union.
Exactly.
And for some things like national security, it does fall on member states. But what we're hoping is that this will serve as an example and help raise the national standards as well in the scope that isn't covered by EU law.
As Nina was saying, it is a step in the right direction. All right, let us take you to northern Italy, because it seems that people there are in a bit of a hurry. That's in today's Eurostars. Nestled in rural Italy, not far from the French border, you find the village of Acquetico. With some residents complaining about speeding motorists, the local mayor set up speed cameras as part of a pilot program. And it seems the town's residents were right. In just 2 weeks, more than 58,000 offences have been recorded, with half of all the cars travelling the route reportedly doing so over the limit. The local authority can perhaps look forward to a substantial cash boost. 58,000 speeding cars in 2 weeks. How is that even possible?
Have you driven in Italy?
I was just thinking that. If you see how people drive in Italy, well. All right, we have a lot more coming up for you. Still to come on Raw Politics, tonight's Raw Moment, plus a new poll that might surprise you about how happy Europeans are with the euro. Don't go away. Welcome back to Our Politics. Brussels will hand down its verdict on Rome's much-disputed budget tomorrow. But as Matteo Salvini ramps up the rhetoric against the EU, a new survey has some interesting results. That's tonight's Power Play. When the euro first went into circulation in 2001, some Europeans were skeptical, divided over whether their countries would be better or worse off. And over the years, that support has continued to fluctuate. Today, though, it seems the majority of people are happy with the euro. According to the results of a new Eurobarometer survey, 3 in 4 Europeans think the currency is a good thing for the EU. 64% of respondents think it's good for their individual country. Happiest are the Irish. And while the Italians are the least convinced, 57% still think the euro is good for Italy, up 12 points from last year, despite a growing spat with Brussels over its spending plans and projected debt. And joining me to weigh up the euro, we have Petras Austrevicius, a liberal Lithuanian MEP with the ALDE group, Christoph Hansen, a Luxembourgish Christian Democrat with the EPP group, and still with us is Rasmussen Global's director, Nina Schick. All right, are you surprised by this result, that the euro is actually quite popular?
I actually am not surprised at all, because coming from Luxembourg, we have the border is from every point you go, it's very close. So you're really dependent on a currency that you can use when you do shopping on a daily basis. So for us, it's of course not a big surprise.
In Lithuania, I think Lithuania did quite low on the approval rating of the euro. Why is that?
Well, I mean, while we are very Euro-optimistic, I mean, generally speaking about the EU membership, but you should probably take into account that Lithuania is the youngest Eurozone country. I mean, it takes for us, a while, to adjust and especially to converge. I mean, it's about the economic convergence after all. And I think the reason behind, among the broad population is euro is blamed because of the price increase, inflation. And the price increase really took some benefits, from the euro membership. But I'm optimistic. It's a matter of time, because we are so dependent. We're not Eurozone surrounded, by the way, but nevertheless, I mean, we are very much dependent on single market.
The optimistic Luxembourg, kind of pessimistic, cautious Lithuania, but then there's Italy, which did that surprise you, that Italians actually want to be part of the euro?
That did surprise me to a certain extent, but having seen kind of the electoral cycle of 2017 when Le Pen, didn't do well with her kind of message to leave the Eurozone or leave the EU, unsurprising, because I think that the public, when they think about this, they're not entirely consistent. So if you look at, for example, Greece, when Syriza, held that referendum in 2015, they said, we want to end austerity, but we don't want to leave the euro and we don't want to leave the EU either. So I think that the public hasn't quite figured out the intricacies in some of the structural flaws, which I think both MEPs on this panel will agree with, are still
I was going to say, because the structural flaws that we talked about of the euro, the currency itself, it existed and it's not going to go away. I think some people are hoping that time would just sweep it under the rug, but that's not going to happen, is it? The problems will come up.
The problems will come up, of course, but if you are in a union, you have some certain rules to respect. You have some discipline to cope with, and then. We will need to work on it. We will never have something completely perfect. So it's something where constant work needs to be done, and I think the proposals emitted by the 5 presidents report is going into that direction, the deepening of the EMU. There is a lot of work still to do up to 2025.
I'll give you the last word on the euro.
Well, Lithuanians are very much in favor of making the economic governance better. So we rely on euro. We understand. I mean, it's our future. It's our economic ties and system. But we're looking at other countries as well perform. I mean, accordingly and evenly, not just to ask 1 or 2 countries. I mean, economic semesters are not properly implemented, and this is a big reason.
So despite
for
the
concern.
risk, this is the path that one takes, it seems.
Indeed.
All right. So it's time now for tonight's Raw Moment. A funny video has resurfaced following that warning shot fired by the DUP over Brexit last night. It may give you some insight into the thinking of the British Prime Minister Theresa May right now. Let's take a look.
Pauline, 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 Pauline. I'm begging of you, please don't break my plan. If you slow this budget down, you end up with that Boris clown. Be careful what you wish for, Pauline. Pauline, 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 Pauline. I'm begging of you, please don't break my plan. Pauline, 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 Pauline. Please don't break it just because you can.
Be careful how much you say is on air. This recording could be like that. You were looking at that. This was your favorite story when you started.
As an observer of Brexit for the past few years, I have to say, I think it's a dismal state of affairs. But the good thing that it did bring us is like a whole new genre of internet memery. How can you not look at that and just love it?
And it gives a whole new image of Theresa May. Dancing in this. All right. Thank you very much for joining us tonight on Raw Politics. We'd like to see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Good night.